The word Nask literally means to copy. This script has also been nicknamed the servant of the Quran because it was predominantly used to write copies of the Quran. In fact, today, there are more copies of the Quran in the Nask script than any other script combined. Nask was one of 6 scripts put forward by calligrapher Ibn Muqla, who lived in the 11th century at the time of the Abbasid Caliphate. This is a small, legible, and fluid script. However, the rules of the script are a little strict, and the reason is that this script was predominantly used for Quranic scripting, and so sometimes there is a trade-off between creativity and legibility. And since, when it comes to the Quran, legibility is a lot more important, you cannot be overly creative with the Nask script. The vertical lines in the Nask script are slightly slanted to the left, and the descending strokes are usually hooked back upwards. Let's now spend a little bit of time and discuss how to create the baseline for the Nask script. The creation of the Nask baseline is actually quite simple. The first thing you need to do is script 2 nuqtas, one on top of the other. The second step is to create 2 horizontal lines, one starting from the top of the top nuqta and the second starting from the bottom of the bottom nuqta, and stretch them all the way till the end of the page. Now, if you did this properly, you should be able to script 2 nuqtas in between the 2 lines on the other end of the page, and they should fit in perfectly. Now, a very common question that I get asked a lot is, how important is it for me to write on a baseline? So the answer to that question is that it's not necessary. You don't have to write on a baseline. You can by all means write on a blank sheet of paper. However, if this is something new to you, if you are writing calligraphy for the first time, I would highly recommend that you write on a baseline. This is because the baseline will help you with your scaling and measurements, and will also help you write letters in their proper proportions. Remember when you were in kindergarten and you were asked to write English in that 4-line baseline just to make sure that your letters lined up properly? This is the exact same concept. Once the Arabic letters become second nature to you, the baseline is something that you can scrap. However, while learning the art, I would highly recommend the use of the baseline in your work. Now here's the live version of the baseline we'll be using for the Nask tutorial going forward. And I know you're probably very confused because this looks very different from what we just discussed. However, most of the things that are here are optional. The core baseline that we just discussed is right here. And the rest of the nuqtas that you see on top of the baseline, and a couple of them on the bottom of the baseline, are actually just optional and are for clarification purposes as I go along in the course. You do not have to create those. However, if you would like, they would definitely help you with your calligraphy work. Okay, so let's get right into this. The individual letter Aleph starts off about 6 or 7 nuqtas above the baseline. It is linear at first, but then it curves and dips downwards. So as you can see, it's slanted towards the left, it's coming down straight, and then it dips downwards, in almost towards the left even. An alternative is basically a shape with the same height, but is curved throughout the way. However, this curve is minimal. The slants of both of these alifs are dipped in by about 1 nuqta. You can go ahead and give the first alif a hat like that. This only applies to the first alternative. The finishing letter Aleph has the same proportions as the individual letter itself. Just like that. Optionally, you can give it a little flick inwards. The individual letter ba starts off about 3 nuqtas above the baseline and ends about 1.5 nuqtas above the baseline. The second stroke of ba has a width of about 5.5 nuqtas, could even stretch it to 6. You'd come down, touch the baseline, and then curve back upwards. Just going to go ahead and fix up any empty spaces. Now, this shape is not symmetric. As you can see, the point where the stroke hits the baseline is actually way towards the left. Now, if you wanted to give it some sort of proportions, you can say that the right side of the line is about 2/3 of the width, and the left side is about 1/3 of the total width of the letter. Now, for commencing letter ba, keep in mind this initial shape here, and we are going to duplicate that stroke. The second stroke is a curved and symmetric shape, and that's where it would continue. The width is about 2 nuqtas wide. Now this shape here, there is an alternative method of creating this. So you would still start off about 3 nuqtas above the baseline, but you would descend all the way down and almost touch the baseline, as opposed to stopping halfway down. The second stroke is a linear stroke going upwards and towards the left. So it would not be a curved stroke like this one here. And this is what the shape would look like, and that's how you would continue onwards. Now, this shape here is about half a nuqta wide. Now, when ba, noon, or ya appear before a jim, this is what the shape would look like. So you would go upwards by about 1 nuqta, you would dip down steeply, and then would begin to level out. So there are the measurements. It's 3 nuqtas wide and 2 nuqtas high. Now when ba, noon, or ya appear before another noon or ra in its finishing stages, then this is what the shape looks like. And this is how you would continue on to script the noon or the ra. So this letter here is about 2 nuqtas wide, just like other commencing letters. When ba, noon, or ya appear before another circular or curved letter, then you can stretch the initial stroke to 3 nuqtas. The second stroke could either be a curved bevel or could be a straight line upwards towards the left. And that's how you would continue. This is again 3 nuqtas high. When ba, noon, or ya appear in the middle of a module, this is one of the ways you can write it. So a small and curved stroke, and this is how you would continue. The width is about 1 nuqta wide. Now, when ba, nun, or ya appear in the middle of a module, but before another bevel letter, you can actually stretch the initial stroke of that letter all the way up till the third nuqta. So just like the initial stroke that we scripted here. As you can see, they are identical heights. And the width of the curve here would also be about 1 nuqta wide. Now I will script the initial middle letter here. And as you can see, all three of these shapes are of identical width. Now, when ba appears at the end of a module, it's basically the individual letter minus the initial stroke here. It would just be the second stroke extended here. So I'll just go ahead and script the second stroke of the individual letter ba right here. And as you can see, this is an asymmetric shape, just like the individual letter. Now this is what a bunch of bevel letters would look like put together. I'll just pause there for a second so you can have a good look at the proportions. The individual letter Jim starts off with a small horizontal stroke about 1 nuqta wide and is about 2 nuqtas above the baseline. The second stroke is about half a nuqta above that and is about 5 nuqtas wide. If you do this right, it should cover half of the initial stroke. Now the second stroke is essentially a curve that starts from the rightmost spot of this horizontal stroke and ends all the way at the bottom baseline. Now this spot is vertically aligned with the leftmost spot of the horizontal stroke. Starts from here and ends right here. Now don't extend further towards the left. Make sure that it is vertically aligned. Now as I script this, you'll notice that the actual descent starts a little bit to the left of the rightmost spot. And there's the curve. Now the next step is to actually change the angle at which you're holding the pen. So hold it in a way that it is perfectly vertical. Now the next stroke is also a curve, which starts off where we left off and would extend down by about 2 nuqtas and will actually supersede towards the right of the rightmost spot of the initial horizontal stroke. So to better explain that, if I was to draw a vertical line from here, there's about 2 nuqtas that you can fit there. The commencing letter Jim starts off with a curved stroke like this. And then a horizontally symmetric shape underneath that initial stroke. Now this is also 5 nuqtas wide. If I was to draw a vertical line from the topmost spot of this initial stroke and then draw a horizontal line, you'll see that these two portions here are actually symmetric. They are about 2 nuqtas high and about 5 nuqtas wide. Now when Jim appears before another Jim, Mim, or Ya, then essentially what you can do with the second stroke is have it curve down like the individual letter, only that it will not go down to that extent. Now when Jim appears in the middle, it looks very similar to the commencing letter. And so, if I was to create a middle letter Jim here, this is what it would look like. And as you can see, this is an identical copy of the commencing letter. Now, this is again one way of writing Jim in the middle. Have it connect from the top. You can also connect the Jim from its right side. And as you can see, I'll put a ba right here. Now when Jim appears at the end of a module, it is identical to the individual letter and is connected from the right side. Now, if Jim comes after a Ya, Nun, or Ba, like the shape that we had discussed earlier, it is again completely identical to the individual letter. The individual letter Dal starts off about 4 nuqtas above the baseline. The initial stroke first goes up slightly and then sharply turns downwards and stops about 1 nuqta above the baseline. The second stroke is a fairly horizontal stroke which is curved upwards near the end. Now notice that the end point of the stroke is 1 nuqta to the left of the origin of the letter Dal. The finishing letter Dal has similar proportions to the individual letter, except that the stem of the letter is a little bit more vertical. So you would go up about 4 nuqtas, and then the second stroke is completely identical to the second stroke of the individual letter. The first stroke for the individual letter Ra is very similar to the first stroke of Ba, except that it starts only 2 nuqtas above the baseline, and it ends right at the top baseline. The second stroke is a circular stroke that is about 3 nuqtas wide, and it goes all the way down to the bottom baseline, and near the end of the stroke you would lift your pen to give it a nice and sharp finish. The finishing letter Ra is actually identical to the individual letter and is connected by the top of the initial stroke of the letter. So if I was to create a ba before the Ra, you'll be able to see exactly where this connects with the Ra. The individual letter Sin begins with the same stroke as the first stroke of the letter Ba, but would stop about half nuqta above the baseline. The second stroke is a linear stroke going upwards towards the left, just like that. The next stroke is a curved stroke about 2 nuqtas wide, just like that. Now you'll script a stroke that is similar to the first stroke of the ba, and this would actually surpass the top baseline. And the last stroke here is a circular stroke that goes down, touches the baseline, and then eventually hooks back upwards. If you notice, this will surpass the top baseline. This circular stroke is about 4 nuqtas wide. When Sin comes in the beginning of a module, it actually looks very similar to the initial part of the individual letter. Except with the last stroke, it would just be a curved stroke leading to the next letter. Now when Sin appears in the middle of a module, it is quite similar to the commencing letter, except with one major difference. So the initial stroke of the commencing letter actually goes downwards towards the right, as you can see here. The first stroke of the middle letter actually goes downwards towards the left. And so consequently, this stroke would be a lot thinner. So as you can see here, the first stroke of the Sin is going downwards towards the left, and then the rest of the letter is exactly the same as the commencing letter. Here we are. When Sin appears at the end of a module, it is very similar to the individual letter, except that the beginning would be like the middle letter here. So to show you what that would look like, the initial part of the finishing letter is just like the middle letter. And the tail end of the letter would be just like the individual letter. So this essentially is a combination of two shapes that we've learned. The individual letter Sod begins with a stroke that goes upwards sharply, and then it descends downwards to the left, but not as steeply. Now, depending on your dominant hand, you can choose to script this either left to right or right to left. Because I am left-handed, it is easier for me to script this from right to left, but you can by all means script it the other way. The second stroke is a slightly curved stroke that first goes downwards and then it meets the top baseline at the point where the initial stroke finished off. So as you can see here, it would touch the baseline and then go back upwards. Now, the tail end of the sod is just like the tail end of the scene. All the proportions would be exactly the same. And those are the proportions of the letter Sod. When Sod appears in the beginning of a module, it actually looks very similar to the initial part of the individual letter. So this would look exactly the same. The second stroke would also descend in a similar fashion. And as you go upwards, the next stroke would actually be a small bevel, almost like the middle letter Ba. Just like that. When Sod appears in the middle of a module, it is just like the commencing letter, except that it would be connected right about the middle of the loop of the letter Sod. The finishing letter Sod looks exactly like the individual letter, except that it would be connected in the middle of the loop. The Ta is actually a combination of the loop of the Sod and essentially the Alif. So we would create the initial stroke of the letter Sod. Now the only difference is that the second stroke here, as we go down, you would flick the pen near the end to give it a nice and sharp finish. I'm just going to go ahead and redo this. And now it's just a matter of me scripting an Alif on top of this loop. Now notice that this meets the loop not at the vertex, but a little bit towards the right of that point. And this shape is also slightly smaller than the Alif. So it is not a full 6 nuqta height, but I would say around 5 nuqtas. When the ta appears in the beginning of a module, it is an exact duplicate of the individual letter, and the only difference here would be that the second stroke of the letter would actually not be flicked, but instead it would be hooked back upwards so that the next letter can continue on from there. So as you can see, this is going upwards, and then you would continue on to the next letter. And then you can go ahead and create that Alif on top of the ta. Just like that. When ta appears in the middle of a module, it actually looks exactly like the commencing letter, except that it would be connected in the middle of the loop, just like the Sad, right there. And when ta appears at the end of a module, it would be just like the individual letter, except that it would be connected by the middle of the loop, right by the baseline. The individual letter Ain is one of the more complex letters that we'll be learning in the Nask script. It starts off with a stroke that is slightly curved and goes downwards towards the right and stops about 1 nuqta above the baseline. The second stroke is essentially the tail end of the letter Jim. So all of the proportions that we learned will apply here as well. So notice that this curve does not surpass the leftmost point of the initial stroke. And then just like the tail end of Jim, we would give this stroke a flick at the end as well, while keeping the pen vertical. The top of the Ain is actually one of the few things in calligraphy that is actually hand-drawn and not scripted. So you would draw a shape that looks like this and would simply go ahead and fill it in. And there we have the letter Ain with all of its proportions. When Ain appears in the beginning of a module, it actually has the same shape as the beginning of the individual letter. So the first stroke would be identical. The second stroke would also start off in a similar fashion. However, as it approaches the baseline, you'll notice that it will curve back upwards. And then you can go ahead and draw that shape on top and fill it in with ink. When Ain appears in the middle of a module, it actually takes a very unique shape. It starts off with a stroke that is horizontal. It stretches upwards and then dips down very slightly. As you can see, there's a very slight dip downwards. The second stroke basically continues from where we left off and goes rightwards. I usually do this in the other direction as I am left-handed. And this is about 3 nuqtas wide. And the last stroke would be a curved stroke coming downwards from the point that we left off. Now notice the spaces here are about half a nuqta at the bottom and on the left side. When Ain appears at the end of a module, it is a combination of the middle letter and the individual letter. And here we would go ahead and script the tail end of the Jim. Turn the pen vertical. And then give it a flick at the end. As you can see, I did not do a great job there. So I'm just going to redo this. And then fill up any empty spaces left behind. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that the head of the middle letter Ain and the finishing letter Ain do not have a gap or opening in the middle. They are closed loops.